Okay, so that's in some sense, to go back to the question about EIP 1559, I think EIP 1559 is a bit naive to the extent that doesn't quite, so the whole supply chain of how these transactions originate, they get communicated to a builder and eventually get put on chain is so complex, and there are so many actors that can somewhat undo the purpose of this EIP 1559, that just simply specifying this base fee seems to be, in a sense, a naive way to guarantee speedy inclusion to users in a simple way. So there are that's kind of one thing that we find, all these delayed transactions, many of which are exclusive to a single builder. We then also find many transactions from the public mempool that are delayed. And again, here transactions are delayed not with respect to the moment in which they appear in the public mempool, but with respect to the moment in which one builder includes those transactions in their block.
So today we have with us Andrea Canidio, who is a senior researcher at CoW Protocol. And today we want to talk about his most recent paper, or maybe line of research, I would say, because I heard it's 3 papers, on how Ethereum is made. So Andrea, maybe you can just dive right in and tell us, what is this catchy title all about?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Hello, everyone. So this paper started by a very simple question. We started from considering the fact that, Ethereum or blockchain in general is supposed to have several properties. One is the immutability. It should allow people to transact in a way that doesn't require intermediaries, trusted intermediaries, so decentralization, so on and so forth. And all those things are true in a sense once a transaction is included on chain, but there is an entire process that determines whether and when and how a transaction is included on chain. And this process has several layers of intermediation, several people handling transactions in a way that sometimes are very opaque. And in a sense, they might completely undo some of the possible benefits of, accessing the blockchain. And so, this was kind of the original motivation. And what really allowed us to write our paper was getting access to a bunch of data from agnostic relay. Okay, don't need to get into the detail of what's relay, but essentially we got a bunch of blocks that were proposed for inclusion to the Ethereum blockchain, but eventually were discarded and never actually were acted on chain. Okay, so this was like blocks built by various builders, including various transactions from users, from searchers, from arbitrage or bot, that were then put into this whole process that we call PBS, out of which one block was selected for inclusion off chain. But by comparing the transaction in blocks that didn't make it on chain to that of the block that did make it on chain, we can somehow get a sense of how much of these different layers of intermediation I was mentioning earlier distort or affect the ability of people to then land their transaction on chain. Like a simple example, which is kind of the first thing we looked through this data, is to check whether a user transaction is included in some of the blocks that are proposed for inclusion on chain, but perhaps ends up, for reasons that sometimes are a bit unclear, but ends up not in the winning block. And then for this user, who has sent a transaction somehow, ends up experiencing a delay of inclusion of one or multiple blocks. Okay, this will be an example of something that, of a way in which this whole process of intermediation affects users and prevents people from actually interacting with the blockchain. Another perhaps more subtle way is that if I send a swap transaction, my transaction might be included in multiple blocks that are proposed for the same auction, for the same slot, but in different ways. So it might be included in different positions in the block. It might be included with different other transactions. And this will then affect how much I receive back from my swap, so the quality of execution, okay? So then the process that selects the block, which is actually quite noisy, okay, there's a lot of latency and randomness, well, this process then that is going to determine which block is chosen to be added on chain and the exact price at which I transact, which is in some senses in a stark contrast to the view of blockchain as a sort of fully deterministic system, immutable, so on and so forth. Like, yes, it's deterministic and immutable once your transaction lands on chain, but it's totally, there is a lot of noise that determines how your transaction is executed.
And so these are only transactions that are on DEXs.
Yeah, so this would be the main example of a transaction whose quality of execution depends strongly on how the block is built. And hence, the same transaction might be executed differently depending on the builder who includes it, how it includes it, and then ultimately which blocks get selected for inclusion on chain.
But on the first part, when you talk about transactions being delayed, that could apply to just simple peer-to-peer transactions.
Exactly. Yeah. So a transfer or whatever.
So,
correct.
So, okay. So if we think back to EIP 1559, the idea, I believe, was that it's too hard for most users to think about the fee that they would want to pay. So they're basically doing this like this trade-off of the more I pay, the sooner I'll get service type of a thing. It's too hard to sort of figure that out on the user side, or at least for most users. So what if we essentially have this base fee that is going to target the block being half empty, so that essentially if I don't care where I end up on the block, then I should be able to basically tip, I don't know, one way or whatever I guess the minimal tip amount is possible to be, and I should be able to get on the block. I may not get at the top of the block, but whatever, I'll get on the block in most cases, because if the targeting is effective, then there's like half the block that's essentially empty for me to enter. And if the builder or the proposer, whomever it is, happens to get the one way, that's an incentive for them to do it. But then you're saying though that that's not quite how it happens, right? So here's, simple retail user me. I just want to send something to Brad, send Ether to Brad. And you're telling me I might be delayed. So who is delaying me and why?
Yeah, correct. That's a very good point, Fahad. So indeed, the stated purpose of EIP 1559 was to just make it easy for a regular user to determine how much they should pay to be included in the next block that is not full, okay, the next block with space, okay. Now, unfortunately, when we look at the data that we have, this doesn't seem to be working as intended, okay. So let me just make an aside that we have a lot of data. Our data are about 20 giga of stuff. We have 15,000 proposed blocks. We have like 2.3 million in transaction block interaction. It's a very rich data set, but it actually corresponds only to 8 minutes of Ethereum history from December last year. Okay, that's because the process that selects this winning block, in fact, produces like thousands of proposed blocks. So this is a big data set. So anyway, the caveat is this is 8 minutes of data, even if it's a large data set. Anyway, what we find in a data set is that user experience delays that even when they pay more than the base fee. And in fact, we look at delays of transactions that are already included in some blocks by some builder, okay? But because they're not included of blocks by all builders, if the winning block is created by another builder, these transactions are not included. And we find that about 21% of user transaction, by the way, okay, we need to distinguish between users and searchers, arbitrageurs, whatever. We have a methodology to do it, but okay, I don't want to get into it right now. So we only look at users, and we find that 21% of user transactions are delayed. Okay, they could have been included. They were already in some proposed blocks, but not in the winning blocks. Okay. Now, why?
Just to clarify, the idea that they could be, do you have a sense? I mean, are we ruling out transactions that were sent exclusively to a particular builder who didn't win the block? Like, are we talking about public mempool?
No, absolutely. Okay. That's actually part of the story. So this transaction appeared somewhere in a block, not in the winning block. Now, 1/3 of those delayed transactions appear as exclusive. So they're user transactions that appear only in blocks built by one builder, and this builder doesn't win. Okay. This by itself is kind of puzzling because although there are reasons why you may want to send your transaction privately without going to the public mempool, there are services that allow users to send privately to multiple builders. And this should be definitely a better option to a user than to send exclusively to one builder, because in both cases you have privacy, but in one case you risk your transaction being delayed. So it's a bit puzzling why we have so many user transactions being shared exclusively to one builder.
But just to clarify here, when we're talking about transactions, we mean it in the general Ethereum sense. So for instance, like, is there an issue potentially of information leakage whereby I am sending it to, only a particular builder and I don't want that information to get to somebody else?
So for the case of user transaction, so these are just so this is all type of transaction, but user transaction. So these are things like transfers or swapping with the Uniswap router or with the 1inch router, simple stuff. What you are referring to, we would classify it as a searcher transaction that typically involve these are like bots that generate transaction programmatically, and they typically do so using at least part of their logic is programmed into a smart contract. So part of their logic is on chain, and typically those are on-chain smart contract which we cannot observe the source code. I mean, something like Uniswap pool or CoW settlement contract, their smart contract whose source code is disclosed so everybody can see what they do, where this guy instead they do everything to obscure the source code of their smart contract. Anyway, what you are discussing applies, but to searchers, I don't think it applies to what we identify as users.
But then the way you're talking about users, it sounds a bit like, so for instance, like I go to Uniswap's website and they use their front end. So yes, the exclusivity is coming from the front end that I am using and how it is routing, right? Like I'm not as a user making these decisions.
No. So the exclusivity or not depends on how you submit your transaction. So essentially it will be like your wallet might have as a default to use the public mempool. That would be a bad idea, but anyway, for a swap, but anyway, it could be this way.
Oh, wait, hold on. So if I use Uniswap's front-end interface, I can choose whether they do the public mempool?
That has to do with your wallet. So the wallet that you use, if it's MetaMask, it will be MetaMask, not the Uniswap front end at the side.
I see. Okay.
Yes.
That was my question anyway. Yeah, the user, how much say does the user have? But yeah, you answered it.
So anyway, this allows me, I was going to discuss it later, but essentially this has to do with the wallet, and there are, for a user at least, because searchers are professional, they might just have the phone number of the builder in a sense and just communicate this way. But user typically either they use the public mempool or they use one of several private mempool that are services allowing user to relay their transaction directly to one or multiple builders without going through the public mempool. And at the time of the study, but also right now, there are actually 5 of these private mempool operators in Ethereum. There is MEV Blocker, MEV Share, Blink, and Merkle, which are very different from each other, but at least in their documentation, they explain that they share their transaction with multiple builders. And then there is MetaMask Smart Transaction, which is a system that is embedded in MetaMask wallet and is actually the default on MetaMask. So if you are using MetaMask on Ethereum and you have not clicked 10 times to change the default setting, you will be using MetaMask Smart Transaction, which is a private mempool, but there is no documentation available. So MetaMask doesn't disclose anything. In particular, they don't disclose the sharing policies, okay? So then we observe a good chunk of user transactions that are exclusive to one builder. Perhaps this has to do with the sharing policy of those MetaMask Smart Transaction. On top of that...
So wait, when you say that, you mean that they I just want to make it clear that they have an agreement with to send their flow directly to one block builder.
We don't know, or they hold an option, so it's different block builder per transaction. You know,
Got it.
transaction don't come with a label that says this is the wallet that originated and this is the but so you have to kind of reverse engineer. It could also be that some of the other private mempool I was mentioning, they say something and they do something different.
Right,
Although
right.
I
Okay.
favor the explanation that says that this is probably MetaMask smart transaction because it will also help rationalize why there is no documentation about what exactly they do. In any case, we have all these transactions that are exclusive to one builder, and therefore, if this builder loses the block, they're not included on chain. And interestingly enough, we have also some transaction where we see like the builder who holds them exclusively losing 2 or 3 blocks, 2 or 3 auctions in a row. And then we find those transactions in the public mempool. And then some of them are actually sandwiched. And some of them are then put on chain by the same builder who had them from the beginning. Okay. So this is all very strange to rationalize.
Yeah.
But in a sense, to us, the most, let's say, bit of a Occam razor, like the simplest explanation that can rationalize many things is that one private mempool operator, possibly perhaps MetaMask smart transaction, they sell or give each transaction exclusively to a builder and resort to the public mempool as a fallback in case this builder don't win, okay? Which is a very bad experience for the user, of course, because these user transactions get delayed and then they get sandwiched, or they, in some cases, sandwiched once they land
By the
public
same
mempool.
builder.
Sometimes it's the same builder, sometimes it's another builder, and then ends up putting them on chain. At that point, they've lost their exclusivity, so it could be any builder.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so that's in some sense, to go back to the question about EIP 1559, I think EIP 1559 is a bit naive to the extent that doesn't quite, so the whole supply chain of how these transactions originate, they get communicated to a builder and eventually get put on chain is so complex, and there are so many actors that can somewhat undo the purpose of this EIP 1559. That just simply specifying this base fee seems to be, in a sense, a bit a naive way to guarantee speedy inclusion to users in a simple way. So there are all. So that's kind of one thing that we find. All these delayed transactions, many of which are exclusive to a single builder. We then also find many transactions from the public mempool that are delayed. And again, here transactions are delayed not with respect to the moment in which they appear in the public mempool, okay, but with respect to the moment in which one builder includes those transactions in their block. Okay, this point.
So they're not even trying it.
Well, you know that different builders have different rules with respect to which transaction from the public mempool to include in their block. And because they are different, a transaction from a public mempool may end up included in blocks by one builder, but not the other builder. And then again, this transaction experience a delay. And in particular, in our data, we find that 17% of transactions from a public mempool that are picked up by at least one builder are not in the winning block and therefore experience a delay. Okay, so another way in which...
Can I just ask a question though about, so how many blocks are actually full? Because for instance, when you talk about builders having different rules for including transactions, again, the EIP 1559 naive mentality to be like, but there should be some space left over for, you know, almost all of them. There can be some rare demand surges where that wouldn't happen, but that should be quite rare. And so, yeah, so how many blocks are actually not full?
Are not full. So in our data or in general. So anyway, full blocks are becoming quite rare. Like I don't think they happen very often nowadays at all.
Well, when you say
in our data, we don't have any.
But so in the general population, I assume we don't know in the sense of like the blocks that are not actually on chain, right? Meaning like we can see obviously how many full blocks there are, all of the blocks that are in the but you have, so I'm saying across the the blocks that are not in the canonical chain, which is, so essentially I'm saying let's use your data as the sample to draw that conclusion.
I don't think we kind of assume that if the winning block is not full, all other blocks are probably also not full, but I have to admit that we never checked. So perhaps there is some nuances
But
there.
you're saying either way, most blocks are actually not full.
Yes, and not that in some sense okay, no, it might. Oh, anyway, yeah, we should check. Yeah, most blocks are not full, and I strongly I suspect that if the winning block is not full, also the other block that we have in our data are not going to be full, but we should double check.
Right. But I guess so then the natural question is, why aren't they filling the blocks with these delayed transactions? Presumably there's a non-zero tip that they're sacrificing.
Correct, because we do see them in some blocks. So those transactions that simulate, they have the correct nonce, they pay more than the base fee. So they are like legit transactions. They could be included and they pay some money. Now there are multiple theories one could have. The one simple one is that in the whole auction, the PBS, the whole process that which transactions are collected, put into blocks by builders, sent to relay, sent to proposer. Latency is very important. So latency is crucial because a lot of the transactions in those blocks are actually arbitrage transactions from that will trade will use as input prices from off-chain financial market and try to then trade with one of the on-chain financial market to make money. So for those transactions, latency is very important, but this means that for the entire process, latency is very important. So it's possible that each builder accounts for the fact that an additional transaction will make the block bigger, and therefore will then slow down the propagation of this block, and therefore will somehow reduce the probability that your block is then chosen and that you can exploit the arbitrage opportunity that you're trying to exploit. So that's one possibility. It's still a case in which, if you want, the latency required by some type of transactions, arbitrage, ends up negatively affecting the inclusion of regular transactions. So I think it's still a problematic explanation, if that's the explanation. But we are currently working on a new paper, which testing this hypothesis, for which we find some support, but we have not yet finished all the test, which is that under EIP 1559, the base fee updates in every period depending on the usage of the previous block. So if the current block uses up a lot of gas, so it has many transactions, the next period the base will be higher. And remember that the base fee determines the percentage of the total fee paid by a transaction that is burned rather than earned by the builder. So in a sense, a builder, our theory is that a builder who expects to win the next block with some non-negligible probability might anticipate that if it puts too many transactions in the current block, the next block base fee will be higher, and then of all the potential fees that could have earned from the next block, a large fraction of it will be burned instead of earned by the builder. So we are studying and trying to see. So this is easy to show theoretically in a model. Another question is whether this is empirically correct. But that would be a story where this is EIP 159 base fee dynamic manipulation that determines the kind of excluding some transaction from the current block.
But so then the way you frame that, if I understood correctly, it's just about lowering the base fee, which mechanically is just about having fewer transactions in this block. But then
Correct.
That means that if we were looking at which transactions were excluded, they should then be low priority fee transactions. Like, it doesn't make sense that we include a transaction on the block paying, let's say, whatever, 10, and then we exclude a transaction that pays 20.
Correct. So this is, but still, if the
So
state
is that true? I guess empirically, like, have you checked to see like which
we do see many transactions that pay more than base fee that are not included.
No, not base fee. I'm talking about the priority fee. So I'm saying, like, if I look at the lowest priority fee transaction on the block, and I look at the ones that were excluded, is it ever the case that excluded transactions have higher priority fees than the lowest priority fee transaction in the block? Because if it's just about the size of the block, then why
Yes.
don't I just flip those two?
Well, I mean, conditional on a given size, you still want to get the highest paying transaction. But yeah, no, but anyway.
No,
it's
that's what I'm saying though, right?
It's actually already this question seems like obvious to answer, but it's not so obvious because you have to start excluding transaction like from sanctioned entities because they pay a large fee and they're not included, but obviously for reasons that are nothing to do with EIP 5.
But some builders do include sanctioned entities, right?
Some builder, yeah, okay, but it's I would say the mechanism by which the
But so, okay,
rationale-
I guess, so, okay, there are complications, obviously, in the implementation.
Yes.
It's also complications about exactly what each builder is seeing at every point in time.
Correct,
right?
correct. Yes,
So,
that's
but-
the difficulty in this research.
But
Yes.
okay, you know, as speaking as somebody who's written a lot of theory models to somebody else who's written a lot of economic theory models, do you think it's the right theoretical model when you're abstracting from like latencies and so on that I would actually, subject to whatever capacity I want to have in that block, because I'm trying to basically affect the base fee on the next block, to take the highest fee transactions? Like, part of what I'm saying is, like, is there more to this story where I'm actually not agnostic across transactions except for the quantity? Because it seems you're highlighting, well, they care about how full the block is.
Yes.
But you're not giving a reason why they might care to include, for instance, a transaction with a lower priority fee, or sorry, why they may include a transaction with a low priority fee and exclude a transaction with a high priority fee. Because if I'm just trying to adjust the quantity, the size of the block, then as you said, it's almost like you just change the capacity constraint in my head on the block. But ultimately, I'm still going to take the highest priority fee transactions,
Correct.
presumably. But is that the right mental model, or is there something else going on whereby I might actually go like, no, I know this has a really high priority fee, and you mentioned it with the sanction case, but other than
Yes.
that, maybe.
So there are many. I think it's the right model given the question that we are trying to study, which is this discrimination and determine whether this is part of what is in the data. Obviously, there are many cases which doesn't hold because that mental model assumes that the value to a builder of including a transaction is just a priority fee. But there are many cases in which that might not be. For example, suppose that this transaction is a swap, and I think it's going to actually generate a very large backrunning opportunity because it's going to move the prices somewhere. Then obviously the value to me is not just the fee it pays, it's also how much money I can get out of it. Or think about a sandwich attack. Like, obviously, the attacker will actually subsidize the inclusion of that transaction because is able to extract value from the user in other ways. So there are all these like edge cases where other consideration become relevant into deciding whether you want to include a transaction. But still, you could think of only looking at ETH transfers from and to non-sanctioned entities and study only those for which arguably the value of inclusion is really just the tip it pays, and check what is the effective threshold for inclusion of each builder, and whether it's larger of the base fee, which would be like the problematic case we are trying to highlight.
Right. So then, part of the reason I'm asking is I'm trying to think about it from a practical perspective of, let's say, retail users and how for instance, wallets should think about this. So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like in some sense maybe the most practical approach would be essentially like we're back to pre-EIP 1559 essentially, because while that may be targeting the block being half full and so on, in theory there's therefore half the block left to be filled if it's the targeting is working effectively. Really, the builder has his own like internal mental size for the block, which is smaller than the actual size of the block, and so you still need to pay enough to kind of get into that size.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, is that right? Like, does this just because remember, like I'm talking about like a normal retail user, like they're not in North Korea, they're not a sanctioned entity. Let's presume that they're
Yes.
not doing anything sophisticated. They just want to do some simple peer-to-peer transaction. Maybe they want to pay a merchant. They found a merchant finally that'll accept Ether. and they want to pay their bill in Ether. Is this just the old school, same way Bitcoin works? Essentially, I should pay enough such that I am in the part, like, in the money in some sense.
Yes. So I don't think it's like Ethereum or is as bad as pre-EIP 159. I think still the base fee serves as some sort of signal. I do think that we're definitely not in the world where we're far from the stated goal of just including every transaction that pays more than the base fee, because that, as you said, each builder has its own logic. Typically, the threshold for inclusion will be higher, and it will be builder specific. So then it's also hard to know. Different builders will apply different rules. Yeah.
But
So
it
that's
also
a
probably would be
problem.
time varying based on the economic environment, right? Because they got to be thinking a little bit about, for instance, if we're in a state for whatever reason that there's like nothing going on, like very, very low volatility, I guess, and maybe there's even like low demand to use the network or whatever, then I gotta imagine the builders will be like, no, let's just take whatever we can take. Maybe we will actually fill the block to the extent that we can. Whereas
Yes.
if we're in a climate where there's a ton of volatility, there's gonna be a ton of arbitrage transactions, there's a lot of money here that might be left on the table if we don't actually lower this base fee. So I guess what I'm saying, that does kind of get us back to the world of, well, it's hard to think about what the right fee to pay now is, right? Like, because I got to keep track of essentially what's going on in the real world. And I wonder actually what the wallets are actually doing. I mean, I still see on MetaMask the options, but I'm not really sure
Okay.
where the numbers are coming from.
Yeah. So we go back. You were disconnected when we were talking about MetaMask. So obviously, so the point is that the fee is only one aspect of whether you're gonna transaction be included and how fast. But there are many intermediaries in the supply chain that will handle your transaction even before it reaches the builder, and those are private RPC or private mempool. And we were mentioning earlier that MetaMask has as a default in their wallet the use of MetaMask Smart Transaction, which is a private RPC endpoint that we don't know what they do. But since we see a lot of user transaction be shared exclusively with one builder, and then actually if the builder who receives those transactions exclusively doesn't win for one or for 2 or 3 blocks, then those transactions are actually dumped in the public mempool as a fallback option. Then it looks like, can I say? Yeah, so there is another reason why EIP 1559 didn't fulfill its promise, is that it turns out that the first determinant of whether you are included on chain is what your wallet does and what the private RPC does with your transaction. Okay.
Yeah, but on that point, so I've actually post EIP 159 found it particularly odd the way this stuff shows up in MetaMask, precisely for the reason you were just alluding to, which is that it seemed to me the first order thing was whether the builder was actually going to win. It's Titan, right? I think does MetaMask typically flow to them?
No, not necessary. No, I mean it's. I mean, there will in our data will be primarily Titan, but we miss a lot of blocks from Beaver. So I think the right conclusion there is more like the dominant builders, let's put it this way, receive those transactions somewhat exclusively.
But for instance, if you say like pay this much to get on the next block, pay this much to get on the second block, right? Because I think even like 15 or whatever. I don't know what numbers they actually put up there, but I seem to remember it looks something like 1 block, 2 block, and then there's another one, and then there's a later one. But the point is, like, okay, in theory, if I pay more, the builder can bid higher. So in theory, me paying more could affect whether the builder would win. But come on, I'm really, really small. This doesn't probably matter, which is why I was thinking like to have pricing for 1 block and 2 blocks, if you're sending it to a private builder, like you're not sending it to the public mempool, is a kind of a confusing thought to me, right? Like if it seems to me if you're not sending to the public mempool, if you're not sending to all builders, then the first order concern is...
Okay, but those are two different things, Fahad. Public mempool and all builders, you could send to close to all builders with private channels without going to...
But do they do that?
So...
Because the execution risk, you wouldn't have the execution risk.
There are 5 private mempool operators on Ethereum. MEV blocker, MEV share, Blink, and Merkle, they all state in their documentation that they connect a user with multiple builder as a way to try to guarantee fast inclusion. Okay, there may be some marginal builder who wins once every 1,000 block perhaps, but I mean, they should connect with multiple builders. Whereas MetaMask for transaction, we just don't know because there is nothing in their documentation that explains how they share their transaction. Then in our data, we observe all these user transactions sent exclusively to one builder, which leads us to believe that MetaMask smart transaction has some mechanism that ends up like selling or allocating each transaction to only one builder. And then if this builder doesn't win for 2 or 3 auctions, the transaction is released in the public mempool as a fallback option.
But look,
How do you know it's MetaMask?
Pardon me?
How do you know the transaction came from MetaMask?
No, we don't know in the data. So as I said,
Okay.
like the data
You're
don't say
assuming-
this transaction came
right.
from MetaMask. I'm just kind of Occam Razor. I have many strange facts. They could be like one of the first 4 private mempool I mentioned that they lie. You know, they don't know. But, you know, this explanation will rationalize many things, including why MetaMask doesn't explain anything.
But okay, even if, for instance, it was sent to every builder that participates in MEV Boost, let's say that's 90% of the market. Let's just say that, right? For the sake of simplicity, it still doesn't quite make sense why the user would be offered 1 block, 2 block, because it seems to me even at that point, the first order concern is one of these 90% going to actually be are they actually going to be able to produce the block, right?
Yes.
And so my point is that like maybe if I go back to the case of, let's say, just one builder, just to talk about the mental model, then in theory there is a channel by which a higher priority fee payment does actually increase the likelihood that the builder who is taking the transaction wins MEV Boost at least, right? And so there is a sense in which I could, in theory, affect the probability that the block that I end up on it becomes a winning block. But, you know, as you're shaking your head out, that's my point, which is like, it's not a high probability, right? Because I'm not providing that much value. I'm just like this tiny user. I'm not doing that much, right? And so that's why I'm sitting here going, I don't actually see why they have that level of granularity when they're asking the user to select a fee. You could think of it almost like, okay, if you go with the let's say the specific case where you imagine they do just send it to one big builder, who we don't have to get into who that big builder might be, but whatever. They send it to one big builder, then it's really just, if this builder is including your transaction, when do they win, right? And I don't understand how the user is supposed to affect that. Like a small user, why are you giving me 3 options at this point in terms of when I'll get on the block, or when I'll get on the chain rather?
Yeah, no, there is no. I mean, this is a relic of, I think, pre-EIP 159 logic, but which doesn't make any sense right now. And that it makes even less sense if you're giving only to one builder, and the probability that this builder wins is determined by MEV transaction and all that. So honestly, you can pay as high as you want, but as a regular
unless
user,
they're internalizing this point that you're making, which is that the builder is actually not filling the block to capacity and has some priority fee that they have in mind to include, then still it would be like a binary thing. It's like, okay, you're going to get on the block, or, you know, maybe you will. Okay, technically, if the market environment never changed, then essentially what that would mean is that if you don't pay this amount, you'll just never get on the block.
Or you have to wait for, you have to wait for the market to change. Like,
no, that's what I'm saying. So if you hold the market dynamics constant, then it's a very binary thing. Like the reservation or the minimum priority fee that this builder will take is whatever, and if you pay it, and you shouldn't in that world pay any more than it, I guess. If you pay it, you'll get on the first block that this builder gets, or the first time the builder wins the MEV Boost auction, but otherwise you'll never get on. Actually, so these delays, what is the time? Like how on average, what's the distribution look like? Are there people waiting days?
We have some transactions that land after 2,000 blocks or something like this, but the majority, I will say, if I have the data here, let me bring them up. Okay, I'm not going to share my screen, but just I have the plot.
Well, he can see the final chain, right? So maybe they followed the actual.
So
chain.
it's like as I said, 21% experience delay of 1 or more block, 10% experience delay of more than one block, and then, you know, kind of converges with, I think there is one transaction in our data set that waited for 2,437 slots before inclusion.
What's the priority fee on that one? Can you see
I
that?
don't know. I should check. Maybe this is from some sanction entity, actually. We should double check. But I mean, the big number is, I would say, 21% delays of at least one block and 10% of at least two blocks. So I mean, those are not small, but like 20% is like one over five user. And this also, you know, this is bad for the user, but also think about how this has the implication of this for the current debate on how should we change Ethereum, how should we improve Ethereum, which has focused very strongly on making Ethereum faster, so faster block time. And there is a lot of brain power and resources spent into trying to figure out how to do that. Turns out that maybe the easiest way to make the experience of using Ethereum faster will be to discipline some of the private RPC endpoints, you know. So, and this is, I think it's an important piece of information to have to then think about how can we improve the experience of using Ethereum.
For these delayed transactions, do you have a sense of what type of transactions they mostly comprise of?
So as I said, this is just a number of, we identify users transactions, okay? There is obviously some swaps, some transfers, many things. I don't know if we have a distribution of types of transaction, but, you know, it's just 1 in 5 of this generic bunch of user transactions that are typically simple stuff.
And I think you mentioned this earlier. You said that, you know, these block builders, was it the block builders you said? Basically, some group of people are doing sexdex arbitrage. And did you check if these delayed ones were somehow going to be profitable? So they were delayed. I think this is what you're alluding to, because you did mention some statistic like this in your paper, I think.
So sexdex arbitrage will be like searches transactions. All sorts of searcher transactions will include that. Interestingly, in our data, you know, we have this heuristic to classify searchers and users, and it turns out that there are almost no searcher transactions that are delayed, in a sense that pretty much all searcher transactions are either included in the current block or they disappear from our data set and they never show up on chain. There may be like 10 transactions out of 10,000 that are searcher transaction and they appear in an auction and they are then included on chain later. So essentially, searcher transactions are either in or they're out. So these arbitrage transactions are either in for that block or we never see them again. Which in some sense it makes sense and confirms how our heuristic so that we use to distinguish searchers from regular users. Yeah. By the way, sure.
Sorry. No. But the 20% of the users, you know, I don't know if you said this, but I was wondering why their transactions are delayed. Is it that it was a potentially profitable transaction and the block builder?
So those transactions appear in our data set. So they were included in some blocks proposed. So already some builders had them and included them. So this rules out many possible considerations with respect to like, these are like
excluding them or
like not valid because of the nonce or because of this or because of that. Okay. And then why? Well, I mean, the one third of them are exclusive to a builder. So I mean, why? So why they're exclusive? Okay, we can speculate. We were discussing earlier, but once we see that they are exclusive, then why is that? Because that builder didn't win, and then kind of these transactions stick around for a few additional slots.
So I'm still trying to totally digest this, and so just tell me if I'm thinking about this the right way. So if it is the case that sometimes the base fee is kind of too high, and the builders want to capture some of that value for themselves, so they want to get the base fee lower. If they just repeatedly kept on keeping the block too small, and in fact, really, this means like less than half, right? Because that's sort of the pivot point. Then the base fee would actually just like go to its lower bound, which I mean,
Not
what I mean
necessarily
is,
less than half, right? It's less than what it will be if you were naively including all transactions that
no, but
then
what I'm saying is if I want to lower the base fee and I fill 52% of the
but a
block,
lower, sorry, relative to today's base fee, you are correct. It should be less than half, but lower than it will be otherwise
no,
if
no,
I were to
you're
include
talking about the
naively.
counterfactual. If I, yeah, so if the block is 60% full versus if the
Yes,
block is 55% full, in the case of the 55% full, the base fee will end up being lower than the 60%, but it will end up being
correct.
higher than what it is on the
Then
given
today,
block because if
correct,
it's
correct. Yeah, yeah,
sure,
yeah.
sure. But what I'm trying to basically what I'm trying to figure out is there sort of like a, is it, can I think of this as like targeting a level for the base fee given current economic conditions? What is the, like, if basically what I'm getting at is like, if you wrote that model down fully and you sort of think about the optimal uh, policy,
Mm-hmm.
can I think of it as targeting a level for the base fee? Or should I think of it as something else? Because then basically what I'm getting at is you might see periods where like I guess I want to say an exogenous shock pushes the base fee up too high, and then all of a sudden we start to see these blocks that are like well under 50% consistently. So first, if I look block by block, and because by eye I've seen times where like the blocks they sort of oscillate in terms of whether they're above above half or below half, which I could imagine rationalizing pretty easily. If the builders are doing what we all think that they were supposed to be doing in the first place, or I guess they weren't supposed to be builders, so the proposers were doing all that we thought they were supposed to be doing in the first place. But then maybe if instead it's the case that they're like targeting a base fee level, what might happen is when the base fee ratchets up too high, is like you sort of consistently see, not just again relative to your counterfactual, but if I really want to get that number down, I really do need to stay under 50%. And but so yeah, I mean, basically, I'm saying like there are predictions that I can imagine if you write out the full theoretical model. And I'm just trying to get at what some of them would be, and I want to get a sense of if they're actually there in the data.
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
So let me
There are
layer one more
multiple
thing
ways to
on.
think about this problem. There is an earlier literature. In fact, the proposer of EIP 1559 already sort of acknowledged among the possible attacks to the mechanism the fact that a builder that is particularly prominent, that wins like a large share of blocks, might in fact create a sequence of empty blocks just to really drive down the base fee to the minimum and then build a super valuable block and pocket a lot of money. And this has been studied in the literature also, to what extent this is sustainable, can this generate some collusion with builders. So that's one type of attack where the goal is to drive it down and then fill it to the max. Now, I guess what we are looking, it's more at a framework where, the builder takes a given today's base fee and anticipate the effect on it tomorrow, but without specifying like a fully dynamic optimization problem that tries to reach a specific level of base fee. It's another way, I think, of another possible
But
way of
wait,
thinking about what a builder does.
let's think through this a bit here. So one thing that occurs to me is that, so okay, what could make the next block really valuable where people are willing to pay a lot on it, and I want to pocket some of that they're willing to pay, is for instance a lot of arbitrage, right? And I imagine so that would probably relate to things like volatility. So for instance, you might imagine that the behavior would be different in very high volatility environments to low volatility. Maybe when it's really, really volatile, I'm like, yeah, let's keep the block small. These small retail user payments that aren't anyway paying me much in a priority fee, like whatever, just dump them. And so let's get that base fee down, and then we know like there's constant ratcheting one way and the other because there's a ton of volatility. Every block is like chock full of arbitrage. I want to capture all of that. So there's a world in which you might actually expect very low base fees when there's like a ton of volatility and I'm not saying that's true, right? But I'm saying, I'm just trying to understand, like, there's got to be some time series variation that would arise out of this kind of behavior that would be relatively easy to see in the data once you kind of know what you're looking for.
I agree, but that's what we are working on. But the thing is like, the empirical prediction, the theoretical prediction is that bigger builder have a higher threshold for inclusion of a transaction in its block because it anticipates this effect on the future more than a smaller builder who is unlikely to win the next block. And the difference between the two thresholds is higher when the current base fee is higher. That has to do with the fact that the updates of the base fee, in fact, is so the percentage change in the base fee is a function of the percentage deviation from the target block size, which means that in absolute term, if the base fee is already higher, the effect of including one additional transaction or not has a much larger impact on the future base fee than if the base fee today is low. Okay, it's constant percentage term, therefore it's higher when the base fee is higher in absolute terms, which means that essentially the empirical prediction that we would like to test is not so much whether larger builder discriminate more than smaller builder, but whether the discrimination is more pronounced when the base fee is higher. So this complementarity between the current level of the base fee and the how likely is
Doesn't
the
that make an assumption about the demand curve?
The demand curve, yeah, no, there is no assumption about the demand curve. This is short-term variation, block by block. I don't think that.
No, but what I was saying is that 1% of 100 is larger than 1% of 10, which is I think the point you were making a moment ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that sort of the willingness to pay between 100 and 101, or maybe use rounder numbers, 100 and 110 versus 10 and 11. You could imagine a demand curve where the willingness to pay is actually the same between 10 and 11 and between 100 and 110. So as the base fee is changing, part of the concern is that there's a willingness to pay, and so you are increasing the pricing and you are essentially losing people who are no longer willing to pay that gap, right? And so you're making a point that the price is actually jumping by more when you have let's say a 10% change at 100 versus a 10% change at 10, right? Just
correct.
Because that's how percentages work, right? But in terms of how much you sort of gain or lose in terms of traffic into the block, that depends also on how many people had that willingness to pay. That's what I mean by the demand curve, right?
True. Yeah.
So I'm saying, okay, I'm saying the empirical prediction would probably be a bit different depending on what you think the demand curve is, depending on how many people are willing to pay in these ranges.
In a sense, this is where, because the change in the base fee has to do with the gas consumption of the transaction, whereas the benefit of including this transaction is the gas times the tip. So, okay, in a theoretical model, if you have like transactions of all gas size, you can look at the epsilon one, and that is going to pin down exactly the threshold for inclusion without affecting the extensive margin tomorrow, because you're really changing epsilon amount the base fee. Anyway, so this is like theories nerds sniping each other on what's the correct model, but we hopefully gonna have the paper completed soon, and you can read all our assumption and empirical results that will really hinges on like when the base fee is higher, there is more discrimination by large builder relative to small. There's kind of this complementarity effect, I think, is gonna help us tease out whether this mechanism is there together with many other mechanisms. It's not that this is an exclusive story where this is the only determinant of builder's choice of inclusion of transaction.
And so you mentioned collusion, but I'm trying to understand how important is collusion in the context, because we talked about this offline, which is that if I'm a big builder and I am lowering the base fee, then precisely because I'm very likely to win a future block, I'm going to benefit from it. Now, other people will benefit from it too, but so I don't really need to. It's not, collusion is not necessary for this to make sense. I could just be big and I'm like, I want to make more in the future. There's externalities in the way that I am affecting other people's payoffs. Like other builders are essentially also benefiting from the fact that I'm doing this, and users are some users are getting hurt because they're having their transactions delayed. Some users are maybe being benefited because they face a lower base fee. I don't know. But I guess my question is, does it make a difference if it's 1 versus n builders separate from the proportion of the market they represent? Like if I had one builder that was 80% of all blocks doing it versus 2 builders that were 40% each of the the frequency to which they win doing it, is there a difference there? Like does the microeconomics of let's say duopoly play a role in what's going on, or can I just think of it from the level of like, this is the proportion of people who are essentially constraining the size of blocks.
So if there is no collusion, essentially I only care about my own probability of winning the next block to determine this trade-off between, okay, earning a bit more money today versus having to burn more tomorrow. The tomorrow part is discounted by my probability of winning the next block, because if I don't win, I don't care. Now, if there is collusion, it's not my probability, because maybe we are two entities, we are nominally separate, but there is some sort of hidden owner that owns both of us, but nobody knows. In which case, when I optimize, I should really use not my own probability as separate entity, but the probability that the two supposedly separate but really integrated entities win. So it's not anymore my, say, 40%, but it's the 40% of me and the 40% of the guy I'm colluding with.
That still sounds like a monopolist problem, just with 80%.
So I should have an even higher threshold for inclusion if I am actually colluding with someone else.
But okay, but the way you framed that, it sounded like you were doing a thought experiment of 80% versus 40%. Like, I agree, like if I'm 40% of the market and I'm just the only person doing it, then I have to internalize that I only have a 40% shot of actually getting these blocks and so on, versus if it's me and you and we're both 40%, but actually Brad owns both of us apparently, and so we're just like actually, going like, well, it doesn't matter whether I get it or the other one gets it.
But I should also use an even higher threshold of inclusion than the one implied by the observed 40%. I'm using
so I'm saying 40%. But that's because, so like if I had a monopolist doing 40% versus a monopolist doing 80%, they're going to act differently, right? Of course, that's true. What I'm wondering more is that if it's two different players, not controlled by the same entity at all, right? Collusion, like in microeconomics, right, where we need punishment schemes and et cetera, right? I'm saying, does that piece add anything, right? Obviously, if there is like a secret owner of the two big players, then it's really like a monopolist that happens to have a bigger share than we really realize, is the way I would think about it. But that, I wouldn't call that collusion then. Like we're not worried about like threatening each other to if we screw up or whatever. It's precisely the case where like we are two different players and we kind of got to keep each other following the path of play.
But is the question, is there theoretical argument for why collusion may happen here?
No,
argument there is like some sort of we each keep the block like emptier than what we could under some sort of, and this is sort of a collusive agreement under the punishment that would be that now if I see you deviate, I start producing super full blocks, and now therefore tomorrow
that's a credible punishment.
If again, this looks like a folk theorem type of things where since there is benefit from cooperation, if the discount factor is large enough, this might be an equilibrium. But I doubt we'll see anything of that in the data, or at least we are still to the point where we'd like to find evidence for the starting mechanism, which is builders are dynamically optimizing the transaction to include to manipulate the future base fee. I don't know if we're ever going to get in the data to see anything like collusion.
And in terms of the data that you're looking at for this newer paper, is it the same data set, or do you have data
from... No,
from...
not necessarily, because the starting data set is useful because it eliminates all... so you can really look transaction by transaction. So, okay, I have one transaction, so all the transaction heterogeneity possible is eliminated because I can look this transaction and check whether it was included by blocks from this builder and that other builder, and correlate this choice with various things. Probability that the builder wins the next block, current base fee, blah, blah, blah. So this kind of eliminates all possible concerns with the fact that, so it's really the same transaction. Now, but if the story is correct, we should be able to observe this also in the data. And in fact, we are now collecting data from the public mempool. And okay, here the difficulties is to make sure that to determine whether a transaction from a public mempool was available and visible to all builders. But then we can then study, those transactions, how much they pay, and what builder won the next block, and whether this builder chose to include those transactions or not. So in a sense, if the story is true, it should hold and should be visible also by just looking at on-chain data and scrapping data from the public mempool. Of course, with the added complexity that, all those transactions are somewhat different. Like one should be a swap, one can be something else. and therefore, there is kind of this transaction level heterogeneity that comes in and plays a role, and also like time heterogeneity. In our data, the time is constant. It's one slot, one transaction. How did builder choose? With a more extended data set that looks only at on-chain data, time heterogeneity is a problem. Anyway, there are more consideration with respect to the empirical analysis and what you can do and the thing that you need to be careful with, but it should be visible also in a more extended data set.
You're gonna say something?
No, just.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was gonna say, sorry that Fahad grilled you for so long about this. I told you it was gonna be chill. But we do
It's
have
okay.
to
He
wrap
knows
up
me in
here.
real
I
life.
know
He's used to
Fahad, I
me.
knew
Yeah.
it was gonna be this way.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have to wrap up soon, but I guess we talked about your first paper and you hinted at what you're doing in the second paper, but you said you had 3 papers out of this. I don't know if you can
Yes.
give us a little teaser about what's coming next.
Yeah, so actually the 2 papers are already available, but the one that is not yet available is the one that discusses builders discriminating transaction as a way to manipulate the base. So this is kind of the one that's still ongoing, and I hope to have it full. But the second paper that is still out looks at a more of a narrower question, which is that we observe a concentration in the builder market, okay, with 2 or 3 builders, depending on the period and also how you want to count it now, basically in building 90% of the blocks. So now a lot, the prevailing theory to why we have such a large concentration has to do with exclusive transaction, meaning that builders typically, so some builders will receive a transaction exclusively from some searchers, say some arbitrageurs choose to work only with one builder, or in fact, some arbitrageur may be integrated with one builder, and the fact that some builders have exclusive access to those transactions then generate concentration, because the more a builder wins, the more this builder is able to convince searchers to send the exclusive flow to them, and this kind of feedback loop means that builder gets even bigger and leads to concentration. So the main channel is being kind of theoretically at least discussed, as it is discussed, is this exclusive transaction. What is the problem from the empirical point of view? That if I only look at on-chain data, I might be able to say, okay, this transaction is included on-chain and was available in the public mempool. Okay, it's clearly not exclusive. But everything that was not in the public mempool could also have been shared to multiple builders without going to the public mempool. So that would not be an exclusive transaction and could not explain why we have concentration. This goes back to the private mempool, how they share their transaction. We know that most of them, they share with multiple builders. Now, with our data, we can figure out which transactions are exclusive and which are not exclusive. Okay, they can be private but not exclusive. And then we can put a number of the importance of these transactions. And essentially, we do that, and we found in our data that about 84% of the value of a transaction that ends up being on-chain, included on-chain, is attributable to exclusive transaction. So exclusive transaction account for 84% of the value of the block. At least in our data, they seems to be really the dominant source of value of a block, which sort of goes in the direction of confirming the existing theories. Also here, there are methodological issues. What is a transaction? Okay, is it just a hash? We also simulate those transactions to extract the logs, and we then do a similarity analysis. As searchers send slightly different transactions to different builders, we can consider them as different transactions, so both exclusive. We could consider the same transaction, they're kind of the same. But we always get numbers in the ballpark between 77% and 84% of the value of the total block coming from exclusive transactions. So yes, this seems to be the dominant source of value from these blocks. And in this case, confirming the more kind of what people have been discussing.
So most of the value of the block is through arbitrage and this type of extractive.
So let's say here we don't get into most of those transactions are swaps, Okay. Interesting. Like most of the transactions do multiple swaps. So we have way more swaps than transactions, and therefore, yeah, they're primarily some form of arbitrage. Now then, extractive, I don't know. Like, okay, now we enter into this whole discussion about lever and which I'm happy to talk because I have a paper about that, but a couple of papers about that. But I don't know if it's the right. We need to do another hour of discussion about that.
Yeah. It sounds like the next thing you should work on is whatever you learn from these 3 papers, see if BuilderNet fixes any of this next. But so hopefully you'll work on that for the community.
Yeah, I don't know BuilderNet, but definitely I think that the whole process poses a pretty big challenge to the usability of Ethereum. In some sense, like the role of builders has already been looked at and discussed, and it remains somewhat problematic. But I don't think we add some nuances of public transaction, not included, whatever. But perhaps our contribution is not as large there. Whereas private mempool operator have largely been escaped the public scrutiny, where in fact it turns out that they are a pretty important piece of this whole supply chain, and their behavior does affect the user and the usability of the system. And I think here we put a spotlight on something that is very important and has been overlooked.
Yeah. Honestly, I think that's a perfect closing statement. I was going to ask you something along those lines, but the takeaway of that, this being important for the usability of Ethereum, I think is like perfect takeaway. So for anybody who reached to the end of this podcast, the most technical one we've had so far, thanks for listening, and thanks Andrea for
Thank you guys.
joining
Thank you,
us
Brad.
today.
Thank you.